June 1944. Across the vast Pacific, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled in that ocean moved silently toward its target. More than 500 warships and transports, carrying 127,000 troops, closed the distance to a volcanic island 13 miles long and 5 miles wide. Saipan, barely 1,250 miles from Tokyo, sat like a fortress in the middle of Japan's inner defense line. If the Americans seized it, their new B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands and return. If they failed, the drive across the Pacific would stall, perhaps for years. Everything hinged on taking this island. By mid-1944, the United States had clawed its way across the Central Pacific. The Marshall Islands had fallen. Truk, once a mighty Japanese naval base, had been bombed into irrelevance. But Saipan was different. Japan's Imperial War Council had declared the Marianas part of their absolute national defense zone, the final barrier protecting the homeland. Lose Saipan, and Tokyo itself would burn. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding from Pearl Harbor, understood the stakes perfectly. He ordered Operation Forager to begin on June 15. The same month, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy half a world away. The timing was no accident. America was now powerful enough to launch two massive invasions simultaneously, stretching its strength across two oceans. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, a hard Marine known as Howland Mad, would command the assault forces, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, backed by the Army's 27th Infantry Division. More than 60,000 men would hit the beaches in the first waves. The Japanese were waiting. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded over 30,000 troops on Saipan, nearly double what American intelligence estimated. They had fortified the island's volcanic heart, where Mount Tapacho rose 1,550 feet above the coastal plains. Limestone cliffs riddled with caves provided natural fortresses. Artillery positions on the high ground commanded clear views of every beach. Saito intended to destroy the invasion at the waterline, and if that failed, his men would fight from the caves and ridges until every last soldier was dead. Neither side expected mercy. Both knew Saipan would decide the fate of the Pacific. On June 13, American battleships appeared off Saipan's coast and opened fire. 7 modern fast battleships under Vice Admiral Willis Lee unleashed 2,416-inch shells at the island from more than 5 miles out, staying clear of suspected minefields. The guns roared for hours, shaking the island. Columns of smoke rose from Garapan and Charan Canoa as buildings collapsed and fires spread. The next day, June 14, older battleships replaced them. These crews knew shore bombardment. They moved closer and hammered Japanese positions with greater accuracy. Over 2 days, 165,000 shells of every caliber pounded Saipan. The Americans believed nothing could survive such punishment. They were wrong. Hidden in limestone caves and reinforced concrete bunkers, Japanese artillery crews waited. Most of the beach defenses remained intact, their guns carefully sighted on high ground overlooking the landing zones. Saito's troops had registered every inch of the approaches. They knew the exact ranges. All they had to do was wait for the Americans to come within reach. June 15, 5:42 a.m. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner gave the order. Hundreds of amphibious tractors loaded with Marines pulled away from their transport ships and formed assault waves. The 2nd Marine Division headed for red and green beaches in the north. The 4th Marine Division aimed for blue and yellow beaches near Charan Canoa. At 7:00 a.m., carrier planes screamed overhead, dropping bombs and strafing the shoreline. Naval guns increased their fire to a crescendo. Then, at 8:40 a.m., the first wave hit the beaches. Japanese artillery erupted. Shells exploded among the landing craft, throwing up geysers of water. The tractors kept coming, engines grinding as they crossed the reef. Some took direct hits and burst into flames, Marines trapped inside or thrown into the water. Others made it to shore only to be destroyed on the beach. Machine guns hidden in concrete pillboxes ripped through the assault waves. Mortar rounds walked across the sand, finding clusters of men. Marines leaped from their vehicles and ran for cover, any cover. Bodies fell on the waterline. Burning tractors littered the beach. The acrid smell of high explosives, mixed with smoke from cane fields, set ablaze by the bombardment. Shattered equipment lay everywhere. But the Marines kept coming. Wave after wave crossed the reef under fire. Within 20 minutes, 8,000 men were ashore, scrambling through barbed wire and trenches, clearing pillboxes with grenades and flamethrowers. Japanese defenders fought from every building, every shell crater. By mid-afternoon, 20,000 Americans had landed, but the beach was far from secure. Artillery from the heights continued to pound the shoreline, killing men and destroying supplies that piled up in chaos. By nightfall, the Marines had carved out a beachhead 6 miles wide, but barely half a mile deep. The cost: 2,000 casualties on the first day alone. That night, Japanese tanks and infantry counterattacked. They came screaming out of the darkness, trying to drive the Marines back into the sea. Naval star shells lit the sky, turning night into flickering daylight. Marines cut them down with machine guns and called in naval gunfire. The attacks shattered against American firepower, leaving hundreds of Japanese dead in front of the Marine lines. The beachhead held. On June 16, the Army's 27th Infantry Division came ashore and pushed inland toward Aslito Airfield. The battle for Saipan had truly begun. General Sato pulled his troops back to the island's mountainous center. Mount Tapachaw became his fortress. At 1,550 feet, its volcanic peak dominated Saipan, offering clear views of the entire battlefield. Caves honeycombed the limestone cliffs. Deep ravines cut through the terrain. Every ridge provided cover for machine guns and mortars. The Japanese had turned geography into weaponry. On June 23, Holland Smith ordered a 3-division assault northward. The 2nd Marine Division advanced along the west coast. The 4th Marine Division moved up the east. Between them, the Army's 27th Infantry Division drew the worst assignment, straight through the center, directly at Mount Tapachaw. The terrain there would soon earn names that needed no explanation. Death Valley stretched before the 27th like an open grave. A barren corridor flanked by steep cliffs on the west and a fortified ridgeline on the east, it offered no cover. Japanese artillery and mortars on the heights had perfect fields of fire. Every foot of ground was registered. Soldiers advancing across the valley floor walked through a killing zone where shells dropped with mathematical precision. The cliffs of Mount Tapachaw rose on one side, studded with caves, sheltering anti-tank guns, machine guns, and infantry. On the other side loomed Purple Heart Ridge, where Japanese troops fired down from concealed positions in the rocks and thick vegetation. The 106th Infantry pushed into Death Valley and immediately came under devastating mortar fire. Men fell by the dozens. Others scrambled for whatever cover they could find in that exposed wasteland. The 165th Infantry attacked Purple Heart Ridge and met withering resistance. Japanese soldiers fought from interconnected cave systems, firing, then disappearing into the rock. Flamethrower teams moved forward, covered by riflemen. They burned out one cave only to take fire from 3 more. Progress measured in yards. Meanwhile, on the flanks, the Marine divisions advanced faster across more open ground. The American line bent into a deep U shape, with the Army at its base struggling through hell while the Marines pushed ahead. The disparity created dangerous gaps, exposed flanks. On June 24, an enraged Holland Smith relieved Major General Ralph C. Smith of his command, an unprecedented move that would ignite a firestorm between the services. But the decision changed nothing about the terrain or the determined Japanese defenders dug into it. The Japanese exploited every natural advantage. They hid in caves during American artillery barrages, then emerged to attack at night. They mixed soldiers with civilians, making target identification nearly impossible. American troops had to clear each cave methodically. Tanks couldn't operate in the broken ground. Artillery struggled to reach positions on reverse slopes. It came down to infantry with rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers, advancing against an enemy who knew every stone, every fold in the earth. On June 25, the 2nd Marine Division seized Mount Tapacho's summit after brutal close-quarter fighting. From the peak, they could finally direct accurate artillery fire into Japanese positions below. The capture marked a turning point. By June 30, after a week of grinding combat, the 27th Infantry finally cleared Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge. Sato's central defense line had been broken. American casualties in that sector alone numbered in the thousands. The Japanese began withdrawing north, leaving their dead in the caves and on the ridges. But they weren't retreating to surrender. They were consolidating for a final stand. By early July, the remnants of Sato's army had been pushed into Saipan's northern corner. Trapped against the sea with nowhere to retreat, roughly 4,000 soldiers, sailors, and walking wounded gathered near Makuncha village. They had no supplies, no ammunition reserves. Many carried only bayonets lashed to sticks, clubs, or knives. Some had nothing but their hands. They knew the end had come. On July 6, Sato issued his final order. There would be no surrender. Every man would die in a Yokusai attack, a suicide charge ordered directly by Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The objective wasn't victory. It was death with honor, taking as many Americans as possible into the darkness. That evening, Sato and Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike 3 years earlier, committed ritual suicide in a cave. Their subordinates prepared for the assault. The Japanese spent the night drinking sake, praying, weeping. Some sharpened their bayonets. Others simply stared into the darkness. The sound of thousands of voices echoed across the Tanapak Plain, where the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment held the line. The Americans knew what was coming. They'd been warned. Soldiers stacked extra ammunition beside their foxholes, fixed bayonets, checked their knives. Then they waited. At 4:45 a.m. on July 7, the storm broke. 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged, screaming out of the darkness. Wave after wave poured down the coastal plain toward a 500-yard gap between the 2 American battalions. Officers waving swords led from the front. Behind them came the masses, howling, running headlong into American positions. One soldier compared it to a cattle stampede that never stopped. The Japanese simply kept coming. The 105th's lines shattered. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red-hot and ceased functioning. Riflemen emptied magazine after magazine until their ammunition ran out. Then it became hand-to-hand. Bayonets, knives, rifle butts, fists. The Japanese overran the battalion command posts. They swept through aid stations, killing wounded Americans where they lay. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien fought with 2 pistols until he was overwhelmed and killed. Private Thomas Baker, badly wounded, asked to be left propped against a tree with a pistol containing 8 rounds. When his position was retaken, the pistol was empty and 8 dead Japanese lay around him. Captain Benjamin Solomon, a dentist serving as battalion surgeon, defended his aid station with a machine gun, killing nearly 100 attackers before he was cut down. The charge rolled on toward Tanapak village, overrunning Marine artillery batteries. But American reinforcements rushed forward and established a defensive line. For 15 hours, the battle raged. Artillery fired point-blank into the masses. Naval guns offshore pounded the Japanese formations. By late afternoon, the attack had spent itself. More than 4,000, 300 Japanese lay dead across the Tanapag Plain and beaches. The 105th Infantry had suffered nearly 1,000 casualties, with 406 killed. 2 battalions had been virtually destroyed. On July 9, Admiral Turner declared Saipan secure. The island had cost the Americans 3,000 dead and 13,000 wounded. But Japan's losses dwarfed theirs. 31,000 troops killed. Only 931 surrendered. The battle was over. The horror was not. In the final days, thousands of Japanese civilians fled north with the retreating army. They reached Marpi Point, Saipan's northern tip, where towering cliffs dropped hundreds of feet to the jagged rocks and crashing waves below. Trapped between the advancing Americans and the sea, they faced an impossible situation. For years, Japanese propaganda had filled their minds with false claims about American brutality. The broadcasts described horrific treatment awaiting any who surrendered. The emperor himself had issued orders promising civilians who died rather than surrender an equal spiritual status with fallen soldiers. Many believed these claims. At 2 locations, later named Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, a tragedy unfolded. Entire families approached the precipice together. Rather than face what they believed awaited them, they chose to leap from the cliffs. Parents and children jumped together. Some held hands as they stepped into the void, crying banzai for the emperor. Bodies fell to the rocks and water below. Hundreds perished, then more. Marines and soldiers watched helplessly from below. They shouted in Japanese through loudspeakers, desperately trying to stop what was happening. American translators and captured Japanese prisoners called out assurances. You will be treated humanely, given food and shelter, not harmed. Some listened. Some climbed down from the cliffs and surrendered, discovering with relief that the propaganda had been false. But others refused to believe. Japanese soldiers hidden among the civilians enforced the emperor's orders, preventing those who wavered from surrendering. Americans worked frantically to save whoever they could. Marines climbed partway up the cliffs, reaching for hands, pulling people back from the edge. Navy patrol boats moved carefully through the waters below, crews rescuing survivors. Marines found infants alive in caves, their parents gone. Medics rushed them to aid stations. Battle-weary Marines sat cradling Japanese babies, trying to comfort them while searching for formula. But they couldn't save them all. The exact number will never be known. Estimates suggest 800 to over 1,000 civilians perished at Marpi Point, combined with the 31,000 Japanese troops lost in battle. Saipan had consumed an entire generation. The Americans, hardened by weeks of brutal combat, found themselves profoundly affected by what they witnessed. Many carried those memories for the rest of their lives. The numbers told part of the story. 3,000 Americans lost, more than 13,000 wounded. For Japan, the losses were catastrophic. 31,000 troops lost in battle. Only 931 surrendered. At least 8,000 civilians perished. Nearly an entire generation gone from a small island in 3 weeks of fighting. But numbers alone couldn't capture what Saipan meant. In Tokyo, the news struck like a physical blow. The emperor himself recognized the truth. With Saipan gone, American bombers could reach the capital. On July 18, Prime Minister Hideki Togo, who had publicly promised Saipan would never fall, resigned in disgrace. For the first time since the war began, the Japanese government admitted to its citizens that Japan was losing. Imperial General Headquarters published an accurate account of the defeat, describing the near-total loss of the garrison. The propaganda machine that had fed the public stories about endless victories finally told the truth. American engineers went to work immediately. Haslito Airfield, renamed Isley Field, was expanded and rebuilt, even while fighting continued elsewhere on the island. By October, the first B-29 superfortresses arrived. On November 24, 1944, 111 of the massive bombers lifted off from Saipan's runways and headed north. 6 hours later, they reached Tokyo. Bombs fell on the Japanese capital for the first time since the symbolic Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. This time, the bombers came from a permanent base, and they would keep coming. Throughout 1945, waves of B-29s launched from Saipan and neighboring Tinian struck Japan cities. The strategic bombing campaign caused massive destruction and casualties. On August 6, the Enola Gay took off from Tinian carrying an atomic weapon that would devastate Hiroshima. The path to that moment began at Saipan. The battle influenced everything that followed. American planners studied the casualty rates, the Saipan ratio, and used them to estimate the costs of invading Japan itself. Those projections helped shape the decision to use atomic weapons. The desperate fighting, the civilian tragedy, the refusal to surrender even when defeat was certain. All of it convinced American leaders that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in unprecedented losses on both sides. Today, memorials stand at Marby Point commemorating those who perished there. The American Memorial Park honors the thousands who fell capturing the island. Saipan remains a place of remembrance, a landmark in history that opened the final chapter of the Pacific War. The road to Tokyo ran through this island, and the sacrifices made here echoed all the way to Japan's surrender.